watching SpaceX catch a Starship booster versus watching, SLS trundle out to the launch pad, at $20 billion a pop. If you don't have leadership that understands the difference between execution and innovation, you just tend to do the same things. On a good day, China operates like Silicon Valley, and if we're really lucky, on that same day, the DoD is operating like General Motors. And if we're not blowing them up fast enough, we're not innovating fast enough. AI is going to be one of those force multipliers, just like the net was, just like microprocessors and computers. I think of GPT and chat AI as kind of the shiny object. The part that's concerning is CEO and co-founder.
The founding partner of
Palantir co-founder.
Steve Blank is a serial entrepreneur who's been building in Silicon Valley since the late 1970s. He's a Stanford professor, one of the most famous authors in the innovation world. These days, he's spending more time in national defense. He's studied the DoD and the Pentagon and been involved in national defense for decades. He has some crazy new bold ideas. Let's hear about him. I'm Joe Lonsdale. Welcome to the American Optimist. It's an honor to have Steve Blank with us here today. Steve, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
So, Steve, you're a serial entrepreneur. You're an author of various things, including 4 Steps to the Epiphany that the lean startup movement was tied to. And these days, you're a professor at Stanford and founder of is it called the Gordian Center for National Security Innovation?
That's it.
Amazing. Let's hear about your background a little bit first, Steve, for everyone. After serving in the Air Force, you landed your first job, I think, is in 1978 in Silicon Valley.
That's correct. Yeah.
And it was the Electromagnetic Systems Lab. Was that Bill Perry's?
That was Bill Perry was my first boss in Silicon Valley.
That's a cool first boss. Tell us about the Electronic Systems Lab and how Silicon Valley helped end the Cold War. What were you guys doing there?
Well, Bill Perry had managed a lab at what was called GTE, bought by Sylvania, basically working on electronic countermeasures for the U.S. government, and then got pissed off and did a startup in the late 1960s, basically to do back then national means of technical verification, at least ultimately overhead systems to intercept telemetry. But he was the first company ever to use computers for SIGINT.
Wow.
And by this time, Bill Perry had become CIA's consultant on signals and telemetry intercepts. Edward Land was CIA's consultant for imagery. So between Perry and Land, they had the technology covered. And Perry partnered with the first head of CIA Science and Technology Division, Bud Wieland, and came up with a really set of interesting things. But I remember when I interviewed Bill, he had a really interesting take. He said, when it became a choice of doing the right thing for the government or making money, we always defaulted to doing the right thing for the government.
I love it.
Stuck with me for, in the rest of my career. The other thing he did was he modeled the company after Hewlett-Packard's culture, which was the gold standard at the time. Except he said at HP, only the executives had stock, and he changed that. Everybody, including the lowest level employees, which included me, got equity in the company, which was pretty amazing because they got bought by TRW.
So that's an amazing way to do things. No, and I love that. It was always something at Palantir and at other companies I work on in defense where if being the good guys means you're doing the right thing for the government, not the right thing to make money. And you don't always see that, especially in the legacy companies these days, unfortunately. And so you spent the next few decades, Steve, as a serial entrepreneur and founder. What were some of the technologies that you helped to build and deploy?
Well, I did 2 semiconductor companies. I would never say I knew anything about semiconductors. One was a startup called Zilog, a competitor to Intel in the early days of microprocessors. And then another with a junior professor from Stony Brook who just started at Stanford named John Hennessy. And that became MIPS Computers. And
Yep.
John was amazing then. And of course, his track record as president of Stanford is pretty well known. But it was pretty interesting going up against Intel, which basically created a monopoly in microprocessors, which obviously has come back to bite them in the country and today.
Tell our listeners what MIPS was. John Hennessy obviously is an amazing man. He did a lot of great things as president of Stanford. What did you guys build together? Tell us a little more about that.
So MIPS was just a different way to build computer architectures on a microprocessor. It was called reduced instruction set computers, which basically said you can have a minimum number of instructions, number one, but most importantly, almost all those instructions would execute in one cycle, which theoretically would make them faster than the existing kind of kludged architectures. And they were kludges back then because they were
Hmm.
kind of developed in piece parts and layers and
Yep.
added features, etc. And so we went head to head to Intel, and Andy Groves crushed us, but it was it was a great learning experience. So I did two semiconductor companies. We did a supercomputer company. I still know what R1/2 is and vector scalar startup time, and was
Amazing.
teaching salespeople supercomputer architecture. Let's see, what else did I do? I did an enterprise software company, which was my last one, called Epiphany. I did a video game company, which reminded me never do a company where your customers are 14-year-old boys playing
Video
sales.
video games is hard. What was the enterprise software company? What were you selling to enterprises?
Basically, we were kind of the first, back in the 90s, enterprise software was client server.
Yep.
And so we were one of the first companies to pick up on the internet and realize that the browser it would be a much more efficient interface and, more importantly, architecture. And so we built three components: an OAuth tool, a data mining tool, and a campaign manager. And it was essentially the beginning of CRM, though Tom Siebel did a much better job in positioning and marketing it. We called it enterprise marketing automation or something, EMA, and he came up with CRM. But it was the same thing. Um, we were essentially the same type of company for a while, and that went public in September 16th, 99, and I retired on September 15th, 1999.
Wise man. So you did okay there.
Now I have a T-shirt that says "Luckiest Man on Earth," number 248. So I'm not confused.
I have a few friends, Steve, who just keep trying to build things and they're smart and they push. And I think the way luck works is that if you're smart and you keep trying really hard, you're going to get lucky, you know?
And show up a lot.
Yeah.
That old line about half the game is showing up. And at least throughout my career, I did a lot of showing up. So
You
I
did.
also did consumer software, consumer hardware. We did a Mac peripheral company. Let's see, semiconductors, consumer stuff, workstations before they were PCs, etc. So I got a pretty broad view of tech, deep tech, and interesting tech in different markets in Silicon Valley.
You're making me a little jealous. I've started a couple dozen companies, and six of them I got lucky are unicorns. But I think you've done more different variety of things than I have, which is pretty rare. So that's a pretty
Yeah,
crazy background.
but it's a question of who has the bigger house, Joe.
Well, in Texas, the houses are big. Come on, what can I say? You give a popular lecture called "The Secret History of Silicon Valley." Where did all this entrepreneurial culture come from, and why is it unique to that region? I think you could tell us better than anyone. You were in the middle of this for so long. Like, why that place? How'd that work?
Well, listen, I'll describe that, but I would probably first tell you why I decided to do that. Is
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier, my first career was in the Air Force, but it was in electronic warfare and electronic intelligence during Vietnam. And EW was a big deal then because we were flying lots of planes and losing them over a pretty tough, what we would now call A2AD system over North Vietnam. Russian provided surface to air missiles and radar guided AAA, and I got pretty intimately familiar with that system. And then I joined ESL, Bill Perry, and now it's 30 years later, but it's kind of feels like a bookend. So that kind of stuck in my head, always asking, even when I was the Air Force, how do we know what to jam and what frequencies and what's the radar order of battle actually look at like,
Yep.
early warning radar and then local radar and then surface to air missiles. And I always kept asking these questions. And even when I was in ESL, and those customers actually didn't like you asking questions, but I was always curious about how did we know what we were building and why. Um, and so I started thinking about how we learned this stuff, and it turned out that the history of EW in electronic warfare started in World War II, and
Hmm.
long history that I talk about in the Secret History. Um, but the real question for me always was, well, who started this, and how did it get started? And it turned out there was a single professor at Stanford named Fred Terman,
Yeah,
who
Terman.
was
Yep.
part of Vannever's Bush Office of Science, Research, and Development. And OSR&D, as some of your listeners and viewers know, basically was a brilliant move by the U.S., the only country who did this in World War II, that outsourced advanced technology to professors. That is, the Vannevar Bush
Yeah.
went to Roosevelt before the war started and said, World War II is coming, and it's going to be a technology war. And big idea, our Army and Navy are ill-equipped to actually build advanced technology. They know nothing about physics. I mean, with all due respect to what was ONR back then, Not really. I mean, there were pockets of innovation. And he said something crazy. He said, scientists should be building advanced weapons.
Hmm.
And of course, the heads of the Army and Navy laughed, and Roosevelt agreed. And so they stood up something called OSR&D, where all the advanced weapon systems, whether they were radar, electronic warfare, rockets, and a small physics program that started in Berkeley and others and ended up over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all were run by civilians. Um,
It's amazing.
and one of those programs was run by Fred Terman from Stanford. When Terman came back from World War II, he basically took all his lab managers and set up an advanced electronics and microwave group at
And
Stanford.
he's the one who introduced Bill and Dave of Hewlett Packard as well, right?
You
He's
bet.
a big
So he
history
was
of
the
the.
kindly professor whose grad students were Hewlett and Packard.
I was sad when we took down the Terman Engineering Building at Stanford. I don't think there's any more homage to him, is there? Because I think there
Right.
really
No.
should be.
So here's the punchline. So I'm thinking about all these connections, but I hadn't written a story, and I get my first office at Stanford in the Terman Engineering
Oh,
Building.
amazing,
and
amazing.
and I thought there was a finger of God pointing to me to tell me that it was someone needed to tell the story about the connection of the DoD and intelligence community and where innovation entrepreneurship came at Stanford, because all research universities in the United States during the Cold War worked on military weapon systems, but it was only Stanford where back by then the Terman was the provost who pointed the university outwards. All other universities were focused inwards.
Yep.
Your best career path could be a professor. Terman said your best career, if you were working in microwaves or electronics at the time, was to take your technology and leave the campus and
Mhm.
actually start something that could be sold to contractors or primes or eventually the
I think
government.
Stanford, as a newer university trying to compete, was always a little more tied to the real world, maybe, than some of its
Right.
East Coast competitors.
And today I label Stanford as an incubator with dorms, which most of the professors don't like to hear, but as you know, is probably the most accurate description of the school.
There's a lot of entrepreneurship going on there. It's interesting because we talk about the government working with Stanford then, and it was really impressive to me how they worked together and how they pushed things forward. And during the space race, Steve, in the Cold War, it seems like the government and the universities were oftentimes even a decade or two ahead of the private sector. And today, it oftentimes in some areas it's the opposite, especially in the government, it's the opposite. What's your take?
I think you're right. It's hard to remember, but the largest purchaser of electronics in the 50s and 60s was the U.S. government. There
Mm,
really was no commercial market at scale. In fact, the first large customers for integrated circuits from Fairchild Semiconductor, which was one of the early chip companies, were not only for the Apollo guidance systems, but for the Minuteman II guidance system, which
yep.
actually kept them in business because they could charge an exorbitant amount of money. But that shifted when we went to consumer products and PCs in the U.S. The amount of dollars being spent by PC companies and others just far exceeded what the military.
So the market just became much more important than the government on the free market side versus the government, and that's a big part of it. You think?
And the rate of innovation, because the rate of competition in the consumer space was much faster than the need of innovation in the military side, because the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War both had their same bureaucratic kind of processes, which had kind of equaled out, even though each country was trying to do an offset strategy to the other. So the consumer space basically dominated,
Hmm.
and by the way, that didn't matter until the last 10 years or so, because inside of FFRDCs, federally funded research labs, and our prime contractors and service weapons labs, we still had the most advanced technology to deter or win a war, whether they were drones or hypersonics or overhead sort of, whatever. Those, things in space were Battlestar Galacticas that
Yep.
required billions of dollars, etc. Um, but that changed about a decade or two ago, as you know, and a
Mhm.
good number of your listeners. Now, all of a sudden, all those things that were owned primarily by the DoD and IC are now commercial products, and half of them being made in China. And here's the rub, and you live this with Palantir. Unfortunately, our acquisition system is still stuck in the system where all that technology was owned by the primes or internally to the DoD system.
Yeah.
And we still haven't kept up with the fact that there's a huge impedance mismatch between how the government acquires and what's outside. The way I describe it is China operates like, and also the speed. Um, on a good day, China operates like Silicon Valley, and if we're really lucky, on that same day, the DoD is operating like General Motors. Um, that's just
Yeah.
not a fair process.
No, this is something that obviously bothers me a lot. When we started Palantir, it was pretty obvious at that point to those paying attention that the Silicon Valley software tech culture had gotten way ahead of the government in a way that it was probably already getting ahead in the 80s and 90s, but I feel like it just Silicon Valley with obviously the wave of the internet wave just pushed it so far ahead that it was almost comical how far behind the government was. So it was, to me, it was not like Palantir was the genius of a thing to start. It was just very hard. It's just, but it was obvious. And then, but the hardware side has become more shocking to me in the last 10 years. Obviously, when we backed Andrew at the beginning and started building on the hardware side was partially because it does seem like the government also got behind in that area, which I don't, it hadn't been, as you know, before.
Right. And here's the rub is that none of this would matter if we didn't have an adversary that doesn't have didn't have the
Yeah.
legacy that we had and didn't have the coin operated Congress as we had. And so you end up where we're competing with someone who's operating with a different organizational design and different clock speed and figured out how to fuse civil and the military together in a way that uh, does a whole nation approach to national security.
So
We've just not gotten out of our own way. I think we're coming to the conclusion through your help and others that we can't keep going on like this. The observation, and then I'll let you move on, is that we have world class people and world class organizations in the DoD and IC. Unfortunately, they're for a world that no longer exists.
mhm.
It's a big idea. I mean, if you would agree we're in a crisis, you would say, in a crisis, why are we appointing the same people we would have appointed when we weren't in a crisis?
Yeah.
Or why do we have the same organizations that we had when execution at a reasonable slow pace? You know, and I think it came, if civilians didn't understand this, watching SpaceX catch a Starship booster,
Yeah.
and versus watching SLS trundle out to the launch pad,
All right.
at $20 billion a pop. If that doesn't make the point between the difference between high speed innovation done by crazy people versus process driven innovation that, listen, gets us there, but not when your adversary is operating at starship speed. Does that make sense? I mean,
Yeah, no, it
you
does. And the thing that really gets me, and I see this in so many areas of our country, is it's not just that things are like 50% more expensive or twice as more expensive. We're literally spending 10 to 100 times more for the same old results, which is becomes a problem. And so I want to ask Steve, obviously, so you founded the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. You've served on the Pentagon's Defense Business Board. So you're involved in this world. There's widespread agreement in DC on some of the challenges of China and the need to innovate more rapidly. I think it's obvious, right? So people see that. Like, where's the conventional wisdom wrong? Where would you push the department to be more bold? Like what's something controversial that you'd say, here's what you have to do?
Well, but by the way, we're talking about
Yeah.
Congress.
Yeah.
It's your fault that some of it's broken when you hired Mike Gallagher. Um, you know, so, so Mike was the most cogent and leading advocate for.
Mike's house got swatted by people on the far right, I believe. I mean, he's had a really tough time the last couple of years. So I think the problem in our society is it's very tough to be a politician right now. I think there's some really nasty forces there that encourage people to get out, which is sad.
But he had the most cogent understanding of both the problem and potentially how to solve it. But I'll tell you a couple of ideas. Also sat on the Navy Science and Technology Board, and world class people, dedicated folks in the Navy, and these boards historically come up with world class incremental solutions. Let's give autonomy another $100 million.
Yep.
Well, guys, how much is let alone a Ford class carrier, 14 billion? But
Yeah.
wait a minute, how much is a strike group? Great, yeah, and
Yep.
we're going to give $100 million to more autonomy. Have we thought about like what the operating concepts should be when we have
Yeah.
a hybrid fleet? And where are those dollars coming from?
Those dollars are coming from me with Saronic. Exactly. That's the
Yeah,
problem
right.
right now. Yeah.
But if you think about it, no, they're not, because the DoD budget right now. Here's the other problem. Number one, the DoD budget is thought of as a zero sum game.
Yeah.
That is, if I want to put a couple $1 billion into an autonomous fleet, well, where's that going to come from? My shipbuilding budget is only X. So problem one is the DoD budget is thought of as a zero sum game. That's a massive mistake. We've not engaged the whole of nation in figuring out who should build things.
Yep.
I mean, you understand, and I know some of your listeners do, that the largest satellite manufacturer is not Northrop Grumman or Lockheed or Boeing. It's SpaceX, right? They have a factory that makes this at a
Yeah.
scale unimaginable that would have made people giggle or,
Yeah.
go like, no,
Yeah.
please stop smoking dope inside the Pentagon.
Yeah.
There's no way you could make 2,000 settle. Put up 6,000. What are we up to? 6,500? I
Yeah.
mean, that's insane. But wait a minute. How much did that cost the government? It's not that Elon didn't get any money, but no, I mean, that's the paperwork budget that Northrop Grumman, or that's their lobbying budget that he
Yeah.
got.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so my point is how come as a strategy we haven't engaged and put incentives to private equity, not just venture capital, but private equity at scale to be investing tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in the new things that we need.
Yep.
Is it tax breaks or whatever? And the reason why, by the way, is do you know the only economists we have in the DoD are the ones working at the Cape,
Mm.
the with green eye shades and whatever. It took two random guys, Jason Rathke and Eric Vollmer, to come up with $1 billion loan authority at the Office of Strategic Capital. How
Yeah.
come we don't have 25 economists thinking about crazy things? And so,
Yeah.
so that's one big idea: is how do we engage the whole of nation? And by the way, we should have understood that when Russia appointed an economist as the head of their defense department, not a general. The light bulb went on
Yeah.
for them. China's been operating civil military fusion for 15 years. We should have figured this out as well. Ash Carter understood this. Is why he stood up DIU, that the integration of all pieces of society. The second part is, DIU has been a Defense Innovation Unit, has been a great science experiment. Now reporting
Yeah.
to the SecDev, has $1 billion budget. Hopefully that doesn't go away. Number one is, we should at minimum probably 10x or 20x it, but it's essentially a shadow R&E, that it is Heidi Schu's department, but quicker. But there is no equivalent for acquisition. That
Yeah.
is, there isn't. We don't have a rapid acquisition budget. Everything goes through the POM and the PBE. That is
Yeah.
the massively complex. Just imagine we threw $50 billion in a DIU for acquisition.
That'd be very entertaining for us. One of the big things we're trying to convince people as well, Steve, is that maybe not having a monopsony, having multiple buyers so that you can have competition. Because I think then you could have one
Well,
buyer shame the other buyers, you know?
so the other piece of this is, why don't we have the combatant commands have the authority to kind of buy from that new
Yeah,
acquisition
I love
thing
it.
for anything less than five, or and that is, if it's going to be attritable, combatant command should be able to buy from that group. So you asked what kind of crazy ideas that we
Yeah.
could come up with, rather than let's add another couple $100 million to make people happy. But Joe, I'm going to push back to you
Yeah.
here for a second, and not to put you on the spot. But you guys have been at it for decades. There's now a whole set of VCs now operating in this space that followed you guys at 8VC. But we don't speak with one voice. That is, every smart VC has a lobbyist, and some of the bigger companies like Palantir and Andrew have their own lobbyists. But we all go to Washington and we talk with individual voices about our line items, or maybe our space. But Silicon Valley Defense hasn't spoken as a group, and I don't mean as a group saying, "Gee, we need more money," but as a group coming up with a set of ideas that, just like I articulated. And my suggestion back to you is, I can't think of anybody better to get a bunch of defense VCs and some creative folks from Andrew or Palantir in a room for a day and say, if we could reorganize the DoD, what would we hand HASC and SASC for language for the NDAA? What would we want? Um, I find myself doing this, but then realize, Congress comes out, visits, we bitch about X or Y, and they go back, and all they heard was bitch, 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 individual item. Does that make sense at all? I don't
Yeah,
mean to
no,
get.
and I think there are some groups that probably could be better organized. I think it's a fair pushback. I think there are some groups that are saying what are the high level frameworks, and of course there's ways we work together. So maybe this is inappropriate to say, but the primes have different incentives sometimes. Sometimes they have the similar incentives as us on some things, but sometimes they have different incentives than us on the innovation side. So, for example, a lot of them wanted to defund some more of the innovation things because they didn't like the fact that it was disrupting them. And
Right.
a bunch of us got together. It was a very big victory, and we kept it funded. And we introduced people running DIU to people in the Senate and various places who they hadn't known before. And we were able to keep the funding and even increase it because it was obvious it was working for the country. And so there are ways in which we'll kind of defend and push these things forward. I think you're right. There's some bolder things around, like you said, giving more acquisition money in parallel to combatant command. I'd love to see competition. In my view, if you only have one buyer, then the buyer could do something that's 50 times as expensive, but quote unquote safe and mediocre, and they get away with it. If you had two buyers and they knew there's a good chance the other one was going to do the thing that shamed them, then they might also take the risk to not look stupid, right? So I think there are things like that we should be putting together to push. And I know some of us have been pushing it a little bit together, but you're probably right. There's ways we can ally and really
I mean,
kind of teach them.
you should, Joe, to be honest, I want to push on you a bit. You are kind of a leading light in the space. Why don't you just call up a bunch of your friends for a weekend and literally have them out to the house and figure out if we could redraw the diagram to compete at speed, what would it look like? Right? Rather than how do I get another $100 million or a couple of $billion for X and Y? That should still go on. I'm not suggesting we stop lobbying for our individual interests, but collectively, we now know what's broken. And we ought to use the imagination we use to build companies to rebuild the Department of Defense and national security. I think we have enough imagination to do that. And here's the insight. The DoD is built around execution of processes and PBE and whatever. Silicon Valley is built around innovators who create new things that never existed before.
Yep.
And here's the rub. The executors never come up with innovation processes. I mean, they'll do it around the edges, and it's not that we don't innovate incrementally, but innovators at the same time hate coming up with process. Process. I don't need no.
I think Elon especially is like so not
Right.
interested in process, but
So
you're right. The government runs on process though, so we have to fix
the
it.
problem we're facing is both groups have a Venn diagram of zero intersection in thinking about what radical reform would look like. And I'm sorry to get us on this high horse, but
Yeah.
I think it's incumbent to the innovators to actually come back and say, no, it should look like this if we want to compete with China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Whoever thought we'd be like shooting at Houthis? I mean,
Yep.
how many people could find them on the map?
No, the whole thing is so one-off right now, Steve. You're right. I mean, I literally was on the phone with a congressman 2 nights ago because the head of the Secret Service is working with him to try to do something to try to protect. I'm not going to say who, but you can imagine who's being threatened right now in our country. After they went at them and they need some new technologies we have access to, and it's kind of an embarrassing mess. Like if you want to try to do something competent quickly versus do it the right way. So I think you're right. We need to come up with the frameworks. There's the thing I would say is I do think there's something about big trusted primes run well that's very positive as well. I actually would like there to be 7 or 8 new primes that are really well run and trusted,
And the things you invested in certainly are on that path. You know, that classic consolidation diagram that shows all the primes we had in the 20th century coming
Yeah.
down to 10. When I sat with Kath Hicks, I said, ma'am, all you need to do is visualize that diagram flipped horizontally. That is, what we need to do is now generate a whole new set of those things.
Yeah.
And we could use some of that exorbitant billions of dollars that we have on the MDAP list. In fact, my line is that the goal ought to be that 10% of the MDAP, major defense acquisition programs, ought to have new entrants on them in the next 3 years. And if they don't, we're simply not rebuilding the national industrial base. We made a set of semi-logical decisions to consolidate when we thought the Cold War was over and the end of history, et cetera. But we've not made the equal decisions, other than a lot of word salad, to actually put money to kind of recreate that ecosystem, this time using private capital and the equivalent to what Roosevelt and Vannevar Bush did in World War II in handing advanced weapon systems to professors and universities would be handing advanced weapon systems designs to startups.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really think about, and I'm not suggesting that, but that's the equivalent of what we did.
This is why instead of the startups, I'd want there to be new trusted primes of a sort that are kind of proven enough. I do agree with your point is that You actually there's probably listen. There's only 2 VC funds have been doing this for a long time, but then there's probably about 15 new ones in the last several years, and that's great. And these are competent technologists. So I think you could take the top 20, 30, 40, whatever. Don't be exclusive. A bunch of VC funds, take the top up and coming companies, and include them in the planning, include them in the strategy, right? And there's a pushback on doing that, but it's crazy because that is our biggest asset as a country is all
Right.
these technologists, and they're
Yep.
not currently included. Like if you tell me that you want to have this certain type of system in 2029. And then there's going to be a competition where a couple of us are going to get funded with the competition in 26. I could then invest right into that, and I could build that. And I could win the competition. So I have been coaching. I have been coaching a bunch of people on all sides around these ideas. I think you're right. It's probably better if we all work together and try to push it together versus
And I'd even
separately.
invite the primes because
Yeah.
eventually, as much as they're trying to, stiff arm all this, their
Yeah.
business model needs to change, right? And some of them understand it, right? You
Mm-hmm.
certainly would have Chris Moran of Lockheed in the room and others, and
Yep.
while they're defending their turf of, even Huntington Ingalls understands that the days of only carriers are going to go away. That they understand it. At minimum, it's going to be a hybrid fleet.
Yep.
Um, right? So having some of them at least understood, at least offer what they're thinking, because they'll try to kill you on K Street anyway. So putting them in the room. In any
Yeah.
case, I don't mean to get us off track here because I know you want to talk about other stuff, but I just want to point out you are the lightning rod for this industry, and we ought
Well,
to act like it.
I'll try to bring more friends together to push. I think you're right. There's an organization there that we could be doing better in the Valley. I want to ask also, Steve. So growing up in Silicon Valley, especially in the 2000s when I was building things, your book was obviously read by everyone, The Four Steps to the Epiphany, and it's kind of the intellectual backbone of the lean startup movement. And it was always interesting because there's obviously a lot of important wisdom there for how Law of the Valley worked, but it always seemed to be pretty different to me than how the defense side of things worked, right? So it's kind of interesting talking to you about defense now because in some ways Palantir was like a fat startup, as was SpaceX, as
Right.
was and even Anduril in some ways. So a lot of these defense things, it's like you can't quite do those things lean startups get you. Is that how you think about it too? Are the principles still apply, or is it different?
Well, what's really funny is, I of all things, I use SpaceX as an example of how you actually can build. Fancy word is an ambidextrous organization, a $20 word that you use in universities to mean can you chew gum and walk at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, can you execute? That is, do continual processes and incremental innovation at the same time. You could do crazy things in the
Mm-hmm.
same large organization. And of course, I think most people listening understand that SpaceX is launching out of 3 launch pads, 2 at Kennedy, 1 in Vandenberg, and that's operational excellence. Those Falcon 9s are popping off. We might hit 120 this year, maybe we'll hit
Wow.
Elon's 144, but in any case, they don't screw around. There's a book, and that process needs to be fail safe. But
Mm-hmm.
when we look at Starship, Elon's model is we're not blowing stuff up, we're not innovating, and if we're not blowing them up fast enough, we're not innovating fast enough. Different culture, different people, different risk profiles. But the big idea is everybody understands Falcon 9 pays your salary, but Starship will pay your pension.
Yep.
And that innovation stuff that's at the edge will move to the core. And they're not separate organizations, even though they're connected horizontally. The learning is going back and forth. The DoD actually does some of this by hacking their own system when we create black programs. So, so if you want to beat the bureaucracy, you put it in a SCIF or a SAP program. And if you've been in some of those, they do operate with speed. Um, does that make sense? That is, we hack our own
Yep.
system. We have SOCOM.
Yep.
You're a startup. Where's the first place you go? You go to SOCOM, or you go to Black Program, or you go to CIA or somebody else who needs something.
In some ways, SpaceX still is doing a lot of what you talked about with failing fast and everything. It's just doing it a different way. That's interesting.
Yes, and so it's possible to build this in the DoD. We've done it before. That is, you need organizations that operate the core in execution, but are capable of actually creating innovation. And the problem is that at the end of the day, it's leadership. If you don't have leadership that understands the difference between execution and innovation, and I mean disruptive innovation, different clock speed, different people, and whatever, you just tend to do the same things.
Mm-hmm.
And who understood that? Bill Perry understood that as SecDef. Ash Carter understood that as SecDev. I would contend most of the rest were political appointees who couldn't tell you innovation from like,
When we were innovating, Steve, for Palantir, we studied a lot, obviously talked to a lot of people, and there were really two parts, I'd say. One part was like we'd had a vision, and we're like, this is the correct answer. You need these nodes that have dynamic ontologies. They can over time they're going to allow them to talk to each other between the US, between allies, and you need to have this platform that does data integration, and you need to have the platform that does collaboration. We had all this big vision, but then there was also like every week or two we'd fly out and show people things, and we get pushed back and we'd iterate. So I guess there was like an iterative part of it, but there was also just like this like if you build it they will come like conviction we had, and we just kept pushing, and it turned out to be right, and it took many years. It seems like a different way to build a company than some of the other things in the valley, or does that relate to how you think about things as well?
that's in fact, the miss of Sisyphus pushing that ball uphill. And the good news is you guys were one of the few that got it up the hill.
Mm-hmm.
But you were fighting against a system that wasn't designed to
Yep.
intake
Yep.
radical innovation.
Yep.
And the point I just made previously is we can actually get the DoD organized to do that. This
Yep.
goes all the way back to us getting together as a community and explaining to Congress how we should organize this, and more importantly, who should be running these things.
Yep.
Right? Doug Beck should not be running R&E. Heidi Shue should not be running DIU. They're different people, different processes, different clock speed. If we could get that idea through, we need both.
Yep.
We need to have so imagine a DOD that actually had that culture when you started Palantir. It wouldn't have taken 10 years.
I would have owned more of the company by the time we got there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things we did 6 years ago was to start a conference and to get the innovators and the senior leadership in the DoD together, called the Red Queen Conference out here at my ranch, and we're going to have it this week on Wednesday and Thursday. And so, and here's the other part that Silicon Valley failed. So those senior leaders, we got admirals and generals, we got the head of a country's joint chiefs of staff out here, whatever. They would then leave our little conference, and then they go visit individual companies in Silicon Valley. They'd all scatter. And it took me 6 years of running this before I went, why don't we invite the companies here across a set of VCs in a set of areas? They've said, do you know there's no Silicon Valley One Defense trade show in the Valley that when people come out and visit, or even for the Reagan conference or something, why don't we all get together across all the portfolios and show our wares? And
a lot of the best ones are still in El Segundo or elsewhere in the country, but you're right, there are some important things right in the valley too to be seen.
Well, so wait a minute. If at the Reagan conference you got all those folks, why isn't there a trade show in a building across the street?
Yeah, I am on the board of the library. I can't make any excuses. I'll ask him and see.
Listen, it took me 6 years of having all these, and then going, where are you guys going? Oh, we're going to go visit Palantir. Oh, we're going to go see Andrew.
You know what the secret answer is that the very top companies that are doing well get into those places like the Reagan thing anyway.
Of course. But senior leadership doesn't understand where those companies fit in the ecosystem unless we expose them to the ecosystem.
No, that's fair. I think that's the right thing to do.
Right? Every VC wants to show them just their portfolio and baby. But I'm just pointing out that there's mutual interest of them seeing everything across the space. Why? Because, Joe, think about it. If it's just Andrew, then people could go, we don't like that company. Those people piss us off or whatever. Now, all of a sudden, if they say, holy cow, there's an entire ecosystem out here, and we're still buying stuff from Lockheed, or who name your favorite prime, for 1,000x, what these in 10 years, there's a whole system to choose from.
As you know, it's a tougher one because there's like a certain bar where you really have to be really, really good to be good enough. And so defense for me is different, Steve, than other areas where it's like, I know every area has like lots of failures, but I feel like it's only the top 10% that are real in a lot of times in these ecosystems, because you actually have to have a certain bar you pass to know how to deploy, and then it actually ends up not working, and so you got to be really careful as well not to expose them to lots of crap, I guess, is the trade-off. There's dialectic there.
So we teach a class called Hacking for Defense, which Jill Felter and I and Pete Newell started. It's now in 60 universities. And so a good number of our students end up trying to sell to the DoDs. And the answer is, I'm kind of agreeing with you, but we could teach them how to do this. And we do. That is not just how to get to an MVP in a demo. The DoD has more demos than anybody knows. But
Yeah.
what's the go-to-market strategy of finding the color of money? Or how do you
Yeah.
get a requirement written for just your stuff? Or, gee, who's the saboteur? That is, who actually
Mm.
has the existing contract? And do you think they're going to sit around just waiting for you to come in, et
Yep.
cetera? You could teach startups this as a process, because the other mistake that goes on in Silicon Valley is thinking sales to the DoD is just simply complicated enterprise sales in the commercial
Oh yeah.
market.
It's
And I
definitely
laugh
not.
hysterically when I hear that, having done both.
It's
Um,
definitely no, that's very fair. I think you have a lot of wisdom there. I tend to think it's gonna end up being 6, 7, 8 new primes that are like 80% of the new impact that matters, not the super distributed thing that but at the same time it was we'll probably be buying a bunch of those eventually into the big companies and figuring it out. But I want to ask a little bit about two things. One other thing is industrial policy. You talk a lot about that. Obviously, it's tied to some of these things we're talking about here. I think you supported the CHIPS Act and call for more policies like it. I on one hand like want America to make sure we're doing the things we need to do to compete against our adversaries. On the other hand, I'm always very skeptical of top-down policy and central planning and dumb rules that get put in place by bureaucrats. I'm curious how you trade that off and what kind of industrial policy you'd like to see.
so in a perfect world, which we try to run for the last 50 years, the market would decide where we put our money in,
Yep.
right? Market smart, et cetera. And so where did VCs put their money? In social media. Was that in the national interest? We could argue possibly not. In fact, I would argue vehemently not. But why did that happen? Well, the quickest returns, the largest returns, et cetera. What did China do? And by the way, if we didn't have a nation state adversary, that would just be fine. And okay, who cares? The problem is we're competing with people who have a different model, and their model has been focused on building things that are building up their national security state. And to me, the best example is like, how many new ships are we putting in the water, and how many DDGs are China putting in the water? And like, great. And where's our investment going in venture capital and private equity, and what kind of incentives do we have? I think the CHIPS Act was the first, major piece of national industrial policy, which you mentioned in probably 75 years, which simply was somebody looking at a map and going, huh, where do all the advanced logic chips come from?
Yeah.
Oh, China calls it a province, right?
Yeah.
That this might cause a problem. Perhaps we should do something. Oh, look, China is building up their chip business. Oh, whose equipment are they using? Oh, they're using us. Why don't we put export controls on? Now, to be fair, we ended up building a dam across half the river because, well, we put export controls on the U.S. companies, Tokyo Electron and ASML, who provide the other parts of the machinery,
Yeah.
don't have export controls.
No, it
So
wasn't done very well. I think at the very high level of theory, it makes sense. The government is very good at breaking things. That I think for a long time we couldn't build stuff because there wasn't enough female construction workers because of the DEI rule. There was just all this comical kind of bad stuff they put in place with these things. Like, is there a way around that?
yeah, so Joe, you just pointed out I think something interesting is so. And now let me give you a discrete answer to your question about national industrial policy. To compete in a world that we live in, not the world that we want, we do need national industrial policy.
Mhm.
One. Two is we need to take this stupid cruft
Yeah.
out of national industrial policy and figure out what the goal was, right? It's like uh, we could decide that the goal is jobs or that the goal is DEI or the goal is something else. That's not really national industrial policy, right?
Yep.
That's something else.
Yep.
So if we separate out the two, which is, do we need to get indigenous chip manufacturing in the U.S.? Sure. Do we need to have a secure supply chain for an industrial base for manufacturing? Sure. What do we need to do that, and what incentives do we need to put in place? I think we did a pretty good job of thinking about on a high order bit of we need chips. Um, but I would probably agree with you. We've probably cluttered it up with things that probably shouldn't.
Very well said. Fair. One more topic before we end. I want to ask about is AI, and this is interesting because you spent a lot of time, I think, correctly talking about how all these things actually now matter because we have a state adversary. We have to respond to state adversary. But it's interesting because last year after GPT-4, you wrote the AI researchers should consider pausing to develop some guardrails. So it's interesting. So on one hand, we got to stay ahead of our adversary. But on the other hand, you were actually worried enough to say we should consider pausing. Do you still believe a pause is prudent? Where are you on this?
What's really interesting is I think of GPT and chat AI as kind of the shiny object that really people are kind of like distracted by. The Nobel prizes that came out this year were really the issue is that Google DeepMind figured out how to do uh, protein folding in
Yep.
a way that basically, accelerated, you know, uh, molecular biology probably by 30 years. We solved, the 3D structures
Yeah.
of 200 million proteins.
Yeah.
We had maybe solved 100,000 of them, or maybe 20,000 of them, manually. We're going to see the same thing in material sciences, and we're going to see the same thing in other deep tech areas. The part that's concerning is, I don't know if you've ever remember a movie called The Forbin Project, there were some others in the 1980s when you connected very smart machines to weapon systems.
Hmm.
Um, this
The
gets this
Terminator.
gets yeah, Terminator being probably the extreme, but the problem here is when we start doing that, um, and there's no men in the loop, and also when we start doing that and we have ethical boundaries, but our adversaries don't have ethical
That's
boundaries
the
in the use of
challenge.
but I should remind your listeners that both the US and the Soviet Union had dead hands on their ICBM systems.
Yeah.
We had transmit radios on a small part of our Minuteman fleet that said if all of our command and control is about to be shot out of the sky or the looking glasses are gone, you push a button and you launched a set of Minutemen with a UHF radio that transmitted the go codes to the rest of the the Minuteman
That's pretty
fleet.
terrifying if someone had figured out those codes.
Well, wait a minute. But the Soviet Union had the same thing called the dead hand,
Yeah.
and those were with human beings. Now, just imagine connecting that to a AI system that wakes up one day and says, "Well, maybe I need to automatically push this button." So, everything we've done in science and technology has been a double-edged sword. When we invented biotech and genetic engineering, we took a pause to say how dangerous could this be, and until Wuhan, we managed not to kill ourselves.
Let's dig in on that. I think you make a good point. On one hand, obviously don't want the AI launching the nuclear weapons. I don't want the AI being able to take over and attack us. That's obviously insane and scary if it's done wrong. On the other hand, for example, one of our companies, Saronic, we're going to producing thousands of weaponized vessels to complement the fleet, and we're teaching them how to use AI. And like in the heat of a battle against a bunch of autonomous stuff from the other side, reacting in real time, you're going to want to be able to do certain things in real time with
Yeah,
the AI. Otherwise, you're just going to lose. And so it's going to be like, well, we're more ethical, but we lost the war. So it
right.
becomes a tough trade off, right? You have to make some of these
Tough
trade offs.
trade-off. And in fact, if your viewers haven't seen it, the Chinese demos of 10 or 15,000 drones simultaneously synchronized in the air are just imagine you're on a carrier watching that
This is
incoming.
this this is why we're going to put our electromagnetic shields in the carriers, like in Star Trek, and have a shield that goes out miles and just turns off all electronics. Right? We need
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Or if we weren't putting all our assets on carriers and maybe putting our assets on a
Yes.
distributed
Both.
architecture.
Some of each. Some of each. Some of each.
Yeah,
That's fair. I have to defend the carriers for now, otherwise they'll attack all my small ships, Steve.
there we go. There we go. That's why we need something more than a zero-sum game in the DoD budget.
I know, and it is very zero sum when you're careful. So it's interesting because you agree AI obviously is necessary to stay ahead of our adversaries, but there
Yeah.
are just lots of risks. Is your high level?
Yeah, well, the risks in a complicated society are compounding. You know, our grid is fragile. We take for granted all these things that keep us alive. Food system is fragile. Our distribution system is fragile. All these things are AI is just going to add one more piece of fragility into a network.
Hopefully we could do it right. On the positive side, we did start American Optimist to push back on cynicism and pessimism. I'm curious, like what areas of innovation excite you for the future? What's going to make things better the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, I've been lucky enough to live through the valley of when we were literally cutting ruby lith masks with an X-Acto knife and
Mhm.
microprocessors when we maybe I think had a couple of thousand transistors on a chip, and now we have like tens and maybe hundreds of billions and eventually trillions in my lifetime. It's just been amazing. And my first half is actually I did stuff, and my second half of my career is I now when you no longer could do, you teach. And so watching my students do amazing stuff. Capella Space were students in my class. Vanderveer Labs were students in my class. I mean,
Amazing.
just a whole set of people who've gone off and done amazing things. It's just a great time to be alive. AI is going to be one of those force multipliers, just like the net was, just like microprocessors and computers. Um, we're living through some amazing times in technology. The problem is is we're also living through some amazing times in geopolitics, as you know, and
Mhm.
are in the middle of. Um, we thought we were smart when we came up with a 2+3 strategy with Mattis in 2018, but we haven't embraced the fact that our adversaries have like morphed again, and our national security strategy hasn't morphed. So I'm happy living through the technology shifts, and I'm concerned that we really haven't been as smart as our adversaries in playing the geopolitics. Um, I mean, they've been playing everything. They've been fostering division in the country. They've been coordinating efforts in regional wars, and I don't think we got the memo yet that they're not actually reading our national defense strategy, and they're acting acting a little differently than our plan.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I'm optimistic. There's not a better place, better time to be alive.
Well, Steve, having leaders like you help push the DoD, help push us to make sure we innovate to stay ahead of our adversaries, and seeing all the innovation coming out, of the tech world and of even places like your classroom and stuff makes me more optimistic. So thank you for all you're doing.
Well, thank you, and thank you for putting your money where your mouth is, or your mouth where your money is. Um, so
Awesome.
both are important, Joe.
Awesome. Good to see you.